Imagine this. You're on a plane. The lights are dim, and everyone is relaxed, when suddenly the captain's voice cuts through the silence, trembling with fear. Is there any fighter pilot on board? Passengers gasp, panic spreads, and no one knows what's coming next. But then, from the back of the plane, a quiet woman opens her eyes. Nobody realizes yet she's about to change everything. Stories like this remind us of the hidden heroes among us. If you believe courage can come from the most unexpected places, then subscribe now and join our journey, because these are stories you'll never forget. The airplane cabin buzzed softly with the steady hum of the engines, a sound most passengers barely notice anymore. For many, it was white noise, comforting in its constancy, a reminder that they were moving smoothly through the skies at incredible speed. It was a long-haul flight from New York to London, one of those overnight journeys where the hours blurred together in a haze of dim cabin lights, tired conversations, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps down the narrow aisle. Among the crowd of travelers was a woman sitting by the window near the middle of the plane. She was black, middle-aged, dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, the kind you wear when you know you'll be sitting still for many hours. Nothing about her appearance stood out. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She wasn't trying to attract attention. In fact, she seemed to want the opposite. As soon as she buckled her seatbelt, she leaned her head against the side of the cabin and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, breathing evenly, as if the chaos of airports and the rush of boarding had never touched her. Around her, the scene was typical of any flight. A young man 2 rows up fiddled with his headphones, scrolling through the in-flight entertainment system. A mother with 2 restless kids tried to keep them entertained with coloring books, while her husband dozed off with his neck pillow crooked awkwardly under his chin. Farther down, a businesswoman typed rapidly on her laptop, the glow from the screen reflecting in her glasses. In the back rows, a group of college students laughed quietly among themselves, swapping snacks and stories. Everything felt ordinary, safe, predictable. As the plane took off, climbing higher and higher into the night sky, passengers barely noticed a shift in pressure or the subtle tilt of the cabin. They were too busy settling in, pulling blankets over themselves, adjusting their reclined seats, or scrolling through their phones one last time before switching them to airplane mode. The attendants moved down the aisles with practiced efficiency, handing out drinks, checking seatbelts, reminding people to relax. The woman by the window never stirred. She seemed almost at peace, her head tilted slightly, her breathing steady. To anyone who glanced her way, she was just another passenger catching some sleep before a long overseas arrival. Nobody could have guessed that her quiet rest would soon collide with the most terrifying moment of the flight. 30 minutes after takeoff, the cabin had settled into its rhythm. The lights dimmed, conversations hushed. The sound of cutlery clinking against trays drifted in from here and there as people began their meals. Everything pointed to an uneventful journey across the Atlantic. But in the cockpit, the atmosphere was shifting. The captain sat in his seat, his eyes locked on the radar display in front of him. At first, it was routine. The green circular sweep moved smoothly, dots representing nearby aircraft appearing in their expected places. But then, something caught his attention. A blip, small, faint, but there appeared on the outer edge of the screen. He squinted, adjusted the range, and frowned. "Traffic at 10 o'clock?" he muttered, his voice low. The co-pilot leaned over. "That can't be right. Nothing scheduled at close on this corridor." The captain adjusted the frequency and called out through the radio. "Unidentified aircraft. This is Flight 221 from New York to London. Please respond." Silence. He tried again, louder, firmer. Still nothing. The blip on the radar moved closer. The captain exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. At first, neither said what they were both thinking. Maybe it was just a glitch. Maybe it was a military exercise running nearby. Maybe air traffic control had made a mistake. But deep down, both of them knew this wasn't routine. The captain pressed the intercom button, his voice carefully measured, rehearsed in calmness. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical situation, but there's no cause for concern. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts until further notice. Out in the cabin, passengers stirred nervously. A few whispered. Parents hugged their children a little tighter. The young man with the headphones paused his music, looking around for answers. But most tried to brush it off. Pilots always said things like that. Technical situation could mean anything. Turbulence, instruments acting up, or just a safety check. But inside the cockpit, both pilots knew it wasn't just technical. The blip was moving faster now, closing the gap between them. No response, no call sign, no recognition from air traffic control. Just a silent approach in the darkness of the night sky. The co-pilot swallowed hard. Sir, that's not commercial. Look at the speed. Look at the pattern. The captain's hands tightened around the controls. His heart rate spiked. He had flown thousands of hours in the skies. But this was different. His mind raced through possibilities. Another plane off course, a malfunctioning transponder, or something far worse. He flicked the switch again, his voice now edged with tension. Unidentified aircraft. This is Flight 221. Respond immediately. You are in restricted airspace. Still silence. The radar blip drew nearer, and for the first time, the captain felt fear prickling at the edges of his composure. He glanced back at the cabin door, hearing faint echoes of movement and chatter behind it. Dozens of souls trusting him to bring them safely across the ocean. And at that very moment, one desperate thought crossed his mind, a thought so unthinkable he hesitated even to say it out loud. If this turned hostile, if this aircraft made a wrong move, he and his co-pilot were trained to handle emergencies, but they weren't trained for combat. That was when he whispered, almost to himself, God help us if this turns into more than a technical issue. Meanwhile, the woman by the window seat slept on, undisturbed, unaware of the storm quietly building in the cockpit. She had no idea that within minutes, the fate of every soul on board might rest not with the uniformed men at the front of the plane, but with her. The blip on the radar grew clearer, brighter, sharper with every sweep of the screen. It wasn't just hanging back anymore. It was approaching. Too fast. Too close. Too deliberately. The captain leaned forward, sweat prickling at the back of his neck. He had flown through storms, handled turbulence, and even dealt with engine malfunctions before. But this was something entirely different. The co-pilot's eyes darted nervously from the instruments to the radar, his hands fidgeting on the controls, though he hadn't been ordered to move them yet. Sir, this doesn't feel right, the co-pilot muttered, his voice low and tight. I know, the captain replied. His jaw clenched as he stared at the glowing dot inching closer. I know. Another attempt was made to reach the mysterious craft. The captain switched frequencies, calling out again. Unidentified aircraft. This is Flight 221 en route to London. You are violating international flight regulations. Identify yourself immediately. Again, silence. The cockpit felt like it was shrinking, every second stretching longer than the last. The co-pilot licked his lips nervously and whispered, What if it's... The captain cut him off. Don't say it. But they both knew what he meant. Hijacking. Hostile aircraft. A deliberate threat. Out in the cabin, passengers started sensing the shift. You could always tell when something was wrong, even when the flight crew tried to mask it. It was in the way the attendants walked faster, whispered more urgently, glanced toward the cockpit with worried eyes. It was in the way the captain's calm, practiced voice didn't quite match the tremor beneath it. The mother with the restless kids held him closer. The businesswoman with the laptop froze mid-typing, her fingers hovering above the keys, her eyes locked on the seatbelt sign that flicked back on. A man near the aisle leaned toward his wife and whispered, Something's off. I don't like this. Fear was contagious and spread quickly in the pressurized cabin. Then the silence broke, not through the radio, but through the co-pilot's gasp. It's right there. The captain snapped his head up and looked through the windshield. At first, it was just a shadow against the vast blackness of the night sky. But then it drew closer, the faint outlines of a sleek aircraft cutting through the darkness, its lights flashing ominously. It wasn't a commercial jet. Everyone in the cockpit knew that instantly. Its design was too sharp, too aggressive, built not for passengers but for power. It swooped alongside their plane, close enough that the faint glint of metal caught the cockpit lights. The captain's stomach dropped. That's military, or at least, it's built like one. The co-pilot's hands trembled. What do they want with us? The intruder circled slowly, deliberately, almost taunting, like a shark circling prey in open water. The captain grabbed the intercom, his voice shaking despite his attempted composure. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a situation that requires caution. The words hung heavy in the air. Passengers stiffened. Murmurs rose, fear creeping into every row. A young boy peeked out the window and pointed. Mommy, there's another plane right there. Heads turned, eyes widened, and gasps filled the cabin as passengers saw the shadowy craft outside. Some began to cry quietly. Others clutched the hands of their loved ones. The group of college students who had been joking minutes ago sat in frozen silence, their faces pale. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot turned to his superior, his voice cracking. Sir, we're not trained for this. We can't outfly them. The captain closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the weight of every life behind him pressing on his shoulders. Dozens of passengers, parents, children, students, travelers. Every one of them depended on his next decision. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with both fear and determination. His voice was quiet, almost trembling. He said the words that no passenger ever expects to hear on a routine flight. Is there any fighter pilot on board? He hadn't meant to say it out loud, not at first. It was the kind of desperate thought you keep locked inside your head. But the pressure was unbearable, and the words spilled out through the intercom before he could stop them. The cabin went silent. It was as if every passenger had stopped breathing at once. They all stared at each other, wide-eyed, trying to process what had just been said. Fighter pilot? On board? This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't technical. This was danger. Real danger. A man whispered sharply. Did he just say fighter pilot? His wife covered her mouth, trembling. The businesswoman snapped her laptop shut, panic rising in her chest. A teenager gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. The mother rocked her children gently, whispering soothing lies she didn't believe herself. It's okay, baby, it's okay. Everything's fine. But nothing was fine. The attendants tried to calm the passengers, but their own voices wavered. They hadn't been trained for this either. Nobody had. Back in the cockpit, the captain's heart raced. He knew how insane it sounded, asking for a fighter pilot among a cabin full of tourists. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. If someone, anyone, had the skill to handle this, they needed to step forward, because without help, their chances of outmaneuvering the shadow in the sky were slim. Seconds ticked by. The silence dragged on. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The captain felt the weight of despair pressing down on him. Then, somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a figure stirred. The silence after the captain's desperate announcement felt heavier than the airplane itself. The hum of the engines, usually so soothing, now sounded like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces pale in the dim cabin light. Some held their breath, waiting, hoping anyone, would stand up and say, I was a fighter pilot. But nothing. The captain's words echoed in everyone's minds. Is there any fighter pilot on board? It was absurd, terrifying, unreal. This was supposed to be a routine flight, not a battlefield. People weren't ready for that kind of reality at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. Rows of passengers froze, staring at each other, silently asking, could it be you? Could it be me? No one moved. No one volunteered. The tension pressed tighter, like invisible hands squeezing the cabin. And then, out of nowhere, the silence broke, not with a scream, not with panic, but with the quietest, most ordinary sound, the soft rustling of fabric as someone stirred in their seat. In the middle of the plane, by the window, the woman who'd been asleep since takeoff slowly opened her eyes. She blinked, adjusting to the cabin light, her face calm as if she'd just woken from a pleasant nap. Around her, passengers sat stiff as statues, fear written all over their faces, but she seemed unaffected. She stretched slightly, rolling her shoulders, then turned to the man seated beside her. His face was pale, his hands trembling against his knees. She noticed a look in his eyes, the look of someone who had lost hope. "What's happening?" she asked gently, her voice steady, warm, as though she were asking about the weather. He swallowed hard, leaned closer, and whispered shakily, "Didn't you hear? The captain's asking for a fighter pilot. There's another plane out there. It's threatening us." For a moment, she didn't react. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly, as if the news didn't surprise her at all, as if she'd expected something like this. Her calmness unsettled him. He blinked, confused. "You don't seem scared," he muttered. She turned her gaze toward the window, peering out into the darkness. And then, for the first time, her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing together in quiet recognition. She had seen it. The shadowy aircraft circling, testing, taunting. When she spoke again, her voice was firm, clear, and startlingly confident. "I used to be one." The man's jaw dropped. "What did you say?" She stood up, smoothing her clothes with a calmness that felt almost surreal given the chaos around her. Passengers turned to stare as she stepped into the aisle, their whispers rising like a wave. She said she was a fighter pilot. "No, that can't be real." "Wait, her?" "Really?" The flight attendants, pale and nervous, rushed toward her. "Ma'am, please remain seated. It isn't safe." But she held up her hand, and the simple authority in her gesture silenced them. There was something in her demeanor, something in the way she carried herself, that demanded respect. Not arrogance, not pride, just quiet confidence. "I heard the captain," she said firmly. "Take me to the cockpit." The attendants froze, glancing at each other, unsure. Passengers leaned into the aisle, watching her like a beacon in the storm. Finally, one of the attendants nodded shakily and led her forward. As she walked, whispers followed her. Some were hopeful, others skeptical. Could she really be? What if she's lying? No. Did you see how calm she was? She has to be real. Every step she took seemed to restore a flicker of hope in the passengers who moments earlier had felt doomed. Even if they didn't know if she was telling the truth, her calmness gave them something to cling to. The cockpit door opened with a hiss. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, suffocating. The captain spun around, his face etched with fear and exhaustion. "Who are you?" he demanded. She met his eyes steadily. "I heard your call. I used to be a fighter pilot. 15 years in the Air Force." The co-pilot blinked in disbelief. "You're serious?" She stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "You need someone who knows how to read that craft out there. Someone who knows their tactics." "That's me." The captain's hands shook against the controls. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't a simulation. We have hundreds of lives on board." She leaned forward, her gaze hard but calm. "Exactly, which is why you need me. Right now, that plane thinks you're an easy target. You're flying patterns they know, using maneuvers they've studied. But they don't know me. They don't know that there's someone here who's trained for this." The cockpit fell silent. The captain studied her face, searching for doubt, hesitation, anything that would betray her. But all he found was conviction. Finally, his voice cracked. "If you're wrong..." She cut him off with a firm shake of her head. "If I'm wrong, we're already in danger. Let me help you make sure we don't fall into their game." The co-pilot exhaled shakily, looking at the captain. "What do we have to lose?" For a long moment, the captain hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, take the seat." She slipped into the co-pilot's chair, her hands moving across the instruments with a familiarity that stunned the crew. It was as if the years between her service and this moment melted away, muscle memory taking over. She studied the radar, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed the intruder's movements. "That's no commercial flight," she murmured. "It's not here by mistake. It's testing us, seeing how you react. But it doesn't expect resistance." The captain swallowed hard. "What do you suggest?" Her eyes locked on the glowing that circled like a predator. She leaned back, her face calm but her voice sharp with authority. Follow my lead, and don't question me. The co-pilot seat felt both familiar and foreign beneath her. Years had passed since she'd last flown in combat. Yet as her fingers slid across the controls, muscle memory surged back like electricity through her veins. Every switch, every dial, every indicator was alive beneath her touch. The cabin might have been a passenger jet, not a fighter aircraft, but to her, the principles were the same: skies, speed, survival. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the glowing radar screen. The intruding craft was still circling, closing in tighter, its movement sharp and deliberate. It wasn't flying like a lost pilot. It was flying like a hunter. The captain sat rigid beside her, sweat rolling down his temple. His hands gripped the yoke, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm not trained for combat," he admitted in a low, trembling voice. "I don't know what you expect me to do." She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on the radar. Her voice, however, was steady, commanding. "I don't expect you to do anything except listen. We're not fighting them. We're surviving them. There's a difference." The co-pilot swallowed hard. "And if they don't want us to survive?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we make sure they regret underestimating us." The cockpit was silent for a beat, the hum of the engines the only sound. Then she barked an order. Bank left. Slowly. Don't show panic. Just drift. The captain obeyed, pulling gently at the controls. The massive passenger plane tilted slightly, enough to signal movement without jolting the cabin. Out in the passenger rows, the shift was felt instantly. Drinks quivered, some spilling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A child whimpered as her mother held her tighter. Passengers stared wide-eyed at the windows, watching the shadowy aircraft follow their every move. Back in the cockpit, the woman's eyes tracked the intruder. Sure enough, it adjusted instantly, mimicking the maneuver. "See that?" she said, her tone sharp but calm. "They're locked on. They want to see if you'll run, if you'll try to outclimb or outdive them. They're baiting you into a mistake." The captain muttered. "So what do we do?" Her gaze hardened. "We don't give them what they want. We stay unpredictable. We show them just enough skill to make them second guess." The co-pilot's voice cracked. "We're in a commercial plane, not a fighter jet. We can't outmaneuver them." She finally turned her eyes toward him, and for the first time, there was a spark of steel in her expression. "No, but I can outthink them." The intruder swooped closer, flying parallel now, close enough that the glint of its metal wings flashed in the cabin lights. Passengers gasped, pressing against windows, pointing in terror. It was a predator flaunting its power, daring its prey to panic. "Altitude steady," she ordered. "Don't climb. Don't dive." The captain's throat was dry as dust. "They're practically scraping our wing. One wrong move and—" "Trust me," she cut him off firmly. "I know how these pilots think. They expect fear. They expect chaos. But we'll give them control they can't read." For long, excruciating minutes, the two planes flew side by side, locked in a silent battle of wills. The intruder dipped slightly, testing, then darted upward in a sharp climb, circling back like a hawk. "Brace," she said suddenly. The passengers jolted as the intruder cut across their path, engines roaring in the distance. Gasps and screams filled the cabin. Someone shouted, "They're going to hit us!" But the woman's eyes narrowed. "No, they're testing our nerves." The captain's breathing was ragged. "If they come at us again, what do we do?" Her voice sharpened. "Then we make them think we're braver than we are." The radar beeped. The intruder was swinging back, faster this time. The co-pilot panicked. "They're charging us." "Not yet," she said calmly. Wait now." "Bank right, 20 degrees." The captain pulled the yoke. The massive jet tilted sharply, sending passengers tumbling against their seatbelts. Cries rang out. Drinks spilled. A baby wailed. But the maneuver worked. The intruder overshot, forced to adjust quickly. Its formation broke for the first time, wobbling in the dark sky. "Yes," she whispered under her breath. "Didn't expect that, did you?" The captain's eyes widened. You forced him off balance." She leaned back, her jaw set. Predators don't like surprises. The intruder circled again, slower this time. It had lost its rhythm. Minutes dragged into an eternity. The cabin was chaos. Passengers praying, crying, whispering in terror. But the cockpit was a world of silence and precision. Every move a gamble, every second a test of nerves. Then, suddenly, the intruder began to pull back. Its path widened, its distance increased. The radar blip grew fainter, farther, smaller. The captain's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. "They're leaving." "Not leaving," she corrected, her eyes still locked on the screen. "Backing off. They know we're not as easy as they thought. They've lost interest in toying with us." As the radar cleared, the tension in the cockpit broke like a snapped wire. The co-pilot sagged into his seat, wiping his forehead. The captain's hands shook as he released the yoke, his body trembling with relief. The woman, however, remained calm, her breathing steady, her hands resting lightly on her lap, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. "You just saved every single soul on this plane," the captain said, his voice filled with awe. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then simply replied, "I did what I was trained to do." The cabin was still buzzing with raw fear long after the intruder vanished into the dark sky. Even with the threat gone, the memory of those minutes hung heavy in the air. Some passengers cried quietly, unable to calm their nerves. Others clung to their loved ones, whispering prayers of gratitude. The hum of the engines, once ignored, now sounded like the sweetest music in the world. Proof that they were still flying, still alive. Then came the applause. It started small, one person clapping, then another, and then a wave rippling across the cabin as passengers rose to their feet, tears streaming down their faces. They clapped for the captain, for the crew, for survival. But above all, they clapped for her, the woman who had walked calmly from her seat into the cockpit and turned fear into hope. The sound filled the airplane, echoing like thunder in the pressurized cabin. Some passengers shouted words of thanks. Others simply cried, overwhelmed. And yet, when the cockpit door opened and the woman stepped out, she didn't raise her hands, didn't bow, didn't seek the spotlight. She simply walked back to her seat. Her stride was steady, her face calm, as though she hadn't just saved hundreds of lives. People reached out to touch her arm as she passed, murmuring, "Thank you," in shaky voices. One mother, tears streaking her cheeks, pressed her baby's tiny hand against the woman's arm. "She's alive because of you," she whispered. The woman only gave a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement, before sliding back into her seat by the window. She pulled the seatbelt across her lap, leaned her head against the side of the cabin, and closed her eyes once more. The contrast was almost unreal. Chaos had swirled around her, lives had hung in the balance, but she seemed at peace, as if she had simply stepped out of a dream, done what needed to be done, and then slipped back into sleep. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom. It was steadier now, though still thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we face something none of us could have imagined. But thanks to one extraordinary passenger, someone with the bravery and skill of a true fighter pilot, we are safe. Please, once more, join me in thanking her for what she's done." Another wave of applause broke out, louder than before. But she didn't move. She didn't stand, didn't wave. Her humility was almost as powerful as her courage. The rest of the flight passed in stunned silence. No one went back to watching movies. No one laughed or argued or complained. Everyone was changed by what they had experienced. The businessman who had been glued to his laptop stared out the window instead, deep in thought. The college students who had been joking earlier whispered quietly, their eyes wide with respect. The mother with the restless children held them close, unwilling to let go. And through it all, the woman by the window slept. Hours later, the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold as the plane descended toward London. The passengers, weary but alive, pressed against the windows to catch their first glimpse of land. A collective sigh of relief filled the cabin as the wheels touched down with a gentle thud. Applause erupted once more. The kind of applause that came not just from landing safely, but from surviving something unthinkable. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers scrambled to collect their belongings, their movements shaky but relieved. Yet even as they bustled, many turned their eyes back to the woman by the window, silently acknowledging her. Some wanted to speak to her, to thank her personally, but something in her demeanor held them back. She wasn't doing this for gratitude. She had done it because it was who she was. When the doors opened, the chaos of the airport awaited. Reporters, officials, flashing cameras. Word had already spread to the airline staff and into the terminal. Flight 221 had been threatened midair, and a passenger, an ordinary woman, had saved it. The captain exited the cockpit first, greeted by cheers and cameras. He tried to speak but stopped, his voice cracking with emotion. He pointed back toward the cabin. "Don't thank me. Thank her." All eyes turned to the aisle, but she wasn't there. The passengers glanced around, searching, realizing too late that she had already slipped away. No fanfare, no interview, no speeches. She had gathered her small carry-on, walked quietly down the jet bridge, and vanished in the crowd of travelers in the terminal. Some passengers rushed after her, but she was gone. A ghost, leaving behind only stories, whispers, and gratitude. Reporters hounded the captain. Who was she? What's her name? Where did she go? The captain only shook his head, smiling faintly, almost in disbelief himself. She didn't say. But whoever she was the reason we're all standing here right now. In the days that followed, Flight 221 became international news. Headlines screamed about the mystery woman fighter pilot who saved hundreds of lives. Talk shows debated her identity. Some claimed she was a retired military hero. Others thought she might still be active, choosing to remain anonymous. But among the passengers, the story was simpler. They remembered the quiet woman who had slept through the flight's early hours, who had woken with calm eyes and steady hands, and who had turned terror into safety. To them, she wasn't just a pilot. She was hope. One passenger later wrote online, "When everyone else froze in fear, she stood up. When we thought we were doomed, she took control." I'll never forget her face, her calmness, her humility. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just sit by the window and close their eyes. And so, the legend of the woman on Flight 221 spread far beyond that plane, carried on the voices of those who lived to tell the tale. The world might never know her name, but the passengers knew one truth, etched forever into their memories. When the captain's desperate voice had asked, "Is there any fighter pilot on board?" she had answered,